people. Is that Kenny or Cartman or something? JP, who is that?
My friend just did a sketch of me, and they thought it was like, so I was
This,
like, "Can I use it?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure." So they just,
this South Park sketch of you.
yes, very much so.
I can see this. It's a hybrid
It's
of you and is it Kenny? I don't know which Cartman is that Cartman? The one
I
who wears stuff like
no,
that?
I don't know. It's weird. I don't think I've ever watched anything about anything from South Park, so I'm just assuming based off of the. All I know is the oh my god, they killed Kenny.
Yeah,
That's
Kenny,
about.
where it has like the little tiny, I don't know, it's like the uh, winter coat equivalent of a burqa or something, where it has like the little tiny space. Isn't
I
that
I
Kenny's?
I thought, yeah, that's Kenny. I think because he's the one that always dies. So
All right, so let's talk about some outer space. Pull the slides. All right, we have microgravity. It's not just microgravity, though. There's a lot more to being an astronaut, or just, maybe you don't have to go through NASA in a couple of years. If you have $250,000, you can go up into orbit for a bit. It doesn't take very long to make a complete revolution, to go around the world and get around there in a couple of hours. Um, but historically, we're talking about astronauts going up in space, and not all astronauts actually go, hang out at the International Space Station. A lot of astronauts, you listen to these interviews with the astronauts, like, yeah, we watched some Battlestar Galactica. I was living in Connecticut at the time and driving from Stores, Storrs, it's a town, to Hartford and back and forth. I listened to NPR, and there was this astronaut interview that reported like what percentage of the astronauts actually go up in space, and it was surprisingly low. But it was surprisingly high how many of them liked Battlestar Galactica, is my recollection. Okay, so microgravity, but first, the altitude stuff. This isn't anything new. Where you get up here, right up here, and it's hard for any life. But a bumblebee is capable of flying, right? That repels vulture, that griffin, can fly up, well over that height, and there's a lot of life that is, obviously the tardigrade can be up there. In outer space, the tardigrade is sort of fine too, but our performance just suffers and suffers and suffers the higher and higher and higher we go, because we don't have, every single breath we take offers us a little bit less sustenance. The partial pressure of oxygen, the amount of oxygen we can actually extract from the air, is reduced and reduced and reduced, owing to that volume pressure interaction. Boyle's law, as we go up, it just becomes very um, sparse. Those particles get sparse, but people live up there, right? So there's a bunch of people living. I mean, if you go to Tibet, there's over 500,000 people living at an altitude of about 15,000 feet. That's pretty high. We would not tolerate that very well, because we don't have any evolutionary ancestry who has endured those stresses, that stress profile, that environmental profile, generation after generation, eliciting changes in the heart, changes in the lungs, changes in enzymes, and the yak, again, very well studied. That yak is very well studied. In particular, hypoxia inducible factor 1, and its roles in the body, and as a target for drug therapy and kind of human health and recovery. Uh, but VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor, we are going to um, pave some new roadway, some oxidative roadway, allow oxygen, a more expansive course to travel, and adjust our metabolism to support it, And let's, adjust our red blood cells too. So the blood and the roadways and the metabolism, all of this stuff is going to adapt both acutely. It'll adapt acutely as you go up the mountain, but generation after generation, you're going to see some genomic differences in species and lineages. Lineages within a species, people, right? And species like, the domestic yak. So hypoxia is just the opposite of hyperoxia, hypo O2. Baria, hypo, all right, it's the opposite of the hyper. And we see that relationship as we go down, as we descend, and as we go up, and what happens in those balloons. Remember, we could suck all that air in a single breath. This is going to take us a lot of breaths. I mean, this is like the size of the person. You have to breathe in and out a lot of times to get all that air into your lungs, and it has the same amount of oxygen in it as this one. And so this is very useful air. You can take that air and absorb that oxygen, send that oxygen to the metabolically active tissue. This is beneficial air down here. Up here, you just ventilation. You really have to breathe rapidly and deeply, and that minute ventilation has to accommodate the altitude differences. So the regulation of breathing, again, um, if you are at altitude and you start to notice that your oxygen is low, your O2 is running a little lean, right? Because the partial pressure is low. You're going to notice that you have chemoreceptors. You're going to notice that. So your breathing rate is going to increase. But then you're going to be exhaling a lot of carbon dioxide and it gets uncomfortable pretty quickly. Is it uncomfortable because your O2 is super high? No. What you're noticing is a difference. The chemoreceptors, like, oh, oof, right, we have some alkaline blood in here, right? So the hydrogen ions, the carbon dioxide, that's what the chemoreceptors are noticing, because you can put that um, on your finger, right? The pulse oximeter. Look at your arterial oxygen saturation, and then just start breathing heavily. All right, yeah, went from 97 to 99 or something. Okay, that's fine. Whatever, it went from like 98 to 100. It's not like it got up to like, oh, I'm at 150% or whatever. That's not what happens, right? But you exhale, you expire a lot of carbon dioxide. As a consequence, elevated pH, right? Elevated pH meaning um, less acidic, right? You have lower carbon dioxide. You have, a lower concentration of hydrogen ions, elevated pH. So ventilation gets reduced. As a consequence, O2 decreases, CO2 increases, right? So that's that Cheyne-Stokes breathing. It's fast, 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 slow, 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 fast, 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 slow, slow, slow. Now you see this in heart failure patients, stuff like that. But you see it in people ascending the mountain, right? You go up the mountain, you get at altitude, and the breathing, you get this periodic breathing, you're just trying to match nature, and you're not doing that good of a job. As soon as the air is not what you need it to be, when the air is not what you expect or need it to be, you your breathing has a hard time, your ventilation has a hard time matching metabolic needs with the environment. It does its best job. It does sort of a Cheyne-Stokes version of a good job. Metabolism is obviously going to change as well. Lots of stuff is going to change when you go up at altitude. That's going to be acute and chronic. The chronic stuff starts really on day one. All right, let's start getting some more red blood cells going. We're making these things constantly. We're just churning red blood cells out. But let's ramp this up a little bit. It's holiday season. Let's put some gifts in the bloodstream. You're going to start increasing that pretty rapidly, and this is a chronic-ish adaptation, right? This isn't just an accommodation. Accommodation is go ahead and breathe fast, breathe deep, breathe fast. That's like that's accommodation. But altering the actual blood, that's adaptation. Now, some of these adaptations are a little bit more long-term. VEGF stuff, vascular endothelial growth factor. You're gonna pave some new roads. That takes some time. Mitochondrial density, that takes some time. Some of this stuff has a time course that is not going to accompany you up the mountain if you're just visiting. But if you're a long-term resident, if you go move there and you live there for a year, okay, yeah, now we're going to start to see some of these changes. But when you introduce exercise to your load, to your stress profile, you'll start to see some additional adaptations being presented, depending on the altitude. Like there is a maximum altitude at which you can get positive adaptation. You keep going all the way up, and okay, all there is death up here. I'm in the death zone. There is no life. That's why it's called the death zone. And sort of the mountaineering colloquial expression is the death zone. That's not a place where people go to adapt. Hard to keep your body weight though. Again, there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. The metabolic work of staying alive up there. You're breathing, the ventilation is increased. You're using more carbs. That's less metabolically efficient because you just can't use as much oxidative metabolism because of that, what people say, thin air, the low partial pressure in that air. Now, the ventilation itself is easier, right? Is easier because there's not as much pressure. If you're down the slopes, much lower than base camp. I mean, if you're like beneath the mountain, you're like a dwarf under the mountain, you're like king under the mountain. That air, it's a little bit harder to breathe. The muscular involvement in ventilation is a little bit more involved, but the air itself, is so much more rewarding. You breathe that thing in and it tastes good to your lungs. Up the mountain, isn't that hard, but you have to do it so much. But the cardiovascular changes, the metabolic changes, the pulmonary changes, ventilation, pulmonary changes. This stuff, all of it combined, you're going to see a lot of weight loss, a pretty rapid degree of weight loss. And especially the higher you get, if you're breathing 7, 8 times and then taking a breath, breathing 7, 8 times, and then taking a step. And like I breathe 7 times and then breathe an eighth. If you breathe 7 times, take a step, breathe 8 times, take a step. That's rough. I mean, that your weight loss here, just preserving tissue. How do you even do that? How do you preserve muscle mass going up the mountain? And you're going to have this metabolic rate that's just chewing stuff up. So, acute mountain sickness, AMS, this thing right here, AMS, acute mountain sickness, you get up to a certain height, right? You get up to, I don't know, 3,000 meters, you get up to 5,000 meters, somewhere in this range, and you're looking at a coin flip odds of whether people are going to get this. Now, it's not a random chance, right? There are genetic variables, there's training that goes into this, but remember, specificity of adaptation, these are the side effects, the consequences, what you would expect to see, the symptoms. But the training, I ran a marathon on Wednesday. I think I can handle going up the mountain. It's very different. You may be very aerobically fit, and there can be some conditioning that can overlap. Remember that Edward Adolph stuff, that Edward O. Adolph, where he says adaptates overlap. As you go up the mountain, it's cold. Okay, so thermal regulation. You're being exposed to that at the same time that you're being exposed to altitude stress. So there's some overlap in a lot of these environments, and being cardiovascularly equipped on day one, even if you've never been exposed to altitude, that's a boon of a kind. That's a benefit. It is a sort of preparation, but it's not quite the right preparation. You can get really good at soccer and you can make it up and down the basketball court effectively. Does that mean you're gonna like? Does the ball go in the hoop? Probably not, because soccer, like, it doesn't even matter if you have arms unless you're the goalie. You use two of your limbs, and in basketball, those other two limbs are super. I'm not making fun of soccer. Are super important. Like, all of the limbs have to play. It's a very different game. That's all I'm saying. Uh, and so VO2 max, man, that's important in soccer. I mean, that's really critical in soccer. You need the lower leg dexterity, you need all this stuff. Eh, Does that transfer over into basketball? Yes, it does. You can get up and down the court and hope the other team is just thrown up on their jerseys, and that way maybe your fast break you can get by them. Now let's go the other way. Basketball, you get really good at basketball. Does that mean you're good at soccer? No, because your feet are probably super clumsy. I mean, like, you're spraining your ankle coming down off a rebound. Come on, So there's a different expression of athleticism. There's a different set of expectations in a sport. It's the same thing with marathons and altitude. Yeah, there's just some of this stuff doesn't overlap. Okay, so like the stuff that would happen for hypoxia, the minute ventilation, all this stuff. EPO, erythropoietin. So these different effects that you're going to see as you go up the mountain, what the kidneys are doing, what the heart rate is doing, your EPO, your BPG, bisphosphoglycerate, or DPG, diphosphoglycerate, that's the same thing, counteracting that shift. So a lot of this stuff as you're going up the mountain, things to expect your body to respond. Those responses, like, oh shit, what is going on? Let me see if I can come up with a way of dealing with these stresses. Now, if your body does not effectively deal with those stresses, you got HAPE and HACE, right? High altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, and then HACE, HACE, the cerebral edema. With both of these, what you see is some vascular permeability. Right, so you're going to get some edema. You're going to get some vascular permeability, and as a consequence, you're going to get some edema. Now, if it's in your brain, if you're increasing the amount of fluid in your brain, that's bad, right? That you better get treatment quick. You better come down off the mountain. And get some treatment in a hurry. For pulmonary edema, just start breathing some better air. Like, don't keep trying to muscle through it. Like, oh, but I'm macho. Yeah, okay, you can be. We'll get a really macho coffin for you. Then we'll make it look really cool. We'll have like old, Randy Savage quotations on it or whatever. Yeah, this is not a time to be macho. Going up the mountain when the warning signs are blinking on your internal dashboard. Just a look at what's going on in the pulmonary edema one. So in systemic circulation, when you get hypoxic, you start climbing the mountain, right? Low partial pressure of oxygen, your oxygen's low. That's in the periphery, systemic circulation, that's a vasodilator. But in pulmonary circulation, you get vasoconstriction, and so that is what initiates this. You get this pulmonary vasoconstriction. You get some porous vessels, right? And then proteins and cells start leaking out. Water follows. You get all this edema. Right, high altitude pulmonary edema. It's not immediately lethal. That's not something where you get this like, oh, I have 48 hours of survival. Set the clock. It's like a Dan Brown novel. All right, it's going to be over in 24 hours. Yeah, but he better address it. He better deal with this thing, because also, if you're having pulmonary problems and your arterial oxygen saturation is going down, neurons, think central nervous system, neurons, they don't do well with ischemic conditions, or even just get that O2 under 90%, and that's not pretty for neurons. It's fine. Your arm can fall asleep. You can sit weird on your legs for 8 hours, like, oh shit, my leg is totally numb, I can't walk, and it comes back to life and it's super uncomfortable and whatever. You didn't just lose your leg when that happens. You can't do that to your neurons. I mean, to your like brain, right? Yeah, that's not gonna go over well. So um, one step removed from pulmonary edema is arterial oxygen saturation. Are you getting that air into across the alveoli and into your blood. And if the answer is no, because your lungs aren't functioning right, then you're looking at cerebral consequences as a it sounds redundant to just say consequence, but you get what I'm saying. Now, the limitations of performance. I wish there were more literature on this. I'm sure there's more than I've seen. I'm sure deep dive into the field, a nice surveying of the field, you can turn up some specifics, but it's not that comprehensive in my exploration, in my hike up this mountain. I have not seen that much literature that really does a good job of characterizing the limits of performance. So these summary statements about what is going to stop us from the fast break. All right, let's put a basketball stadium in Peru and let's see what the game is like. Okay, let's take some deep three pointers because I just run it up and down so much. The ball just coasts through the air, and it would just to be too much effort to drive it all the way to the hoop. Um, but what is limiting our performance there? The muscle's performance, the muscle's function seems to be a very yeah. Now, what limits muscle performance? That's a totally different, argument of what causes a muscle to stop working. Well, there's tons of things. We talk about that in another class, in the muscle phys class. Or for us, that'll be 248 of cellular mechanisms and central mechanisms of muscle fatigue. So this does get into a larger um, topic that would take a lot of unpacking, but very generally, muscle fatigue under about 15,000 feet, that's really what's going to be the culprit, where the muscle just decides not to support your decision. Like, all right, I'm going to do this, and the muscle, I'll go halfway. You go over that, between 15, 20,000 feet or so, and it just depends on the training history. It depends on the conditioning. It depends on I don't know, everything from body comp to like VO2 max. I mean, there's just so much going on here that kind of an individuation becomes a consideration. And over that, and you just good luck breathing. It's just you're not gonna. The air does not permit your task. Now, lowlanders and those natives, the high altitude natives, or we can just call them highlanders. Exercise economy. Remember that was the one that's sort of interesting. It's interesting that they have a similar exercise economy at their native altitudes, because as you go up in altitude, you and me, we are going to be much more glycolytic, and that's not good for exercise economy. Now, exercise economy is, what are we doing for so the metabolism per work accomplished? Metabolically, what is our input? And in terms of work, what is our output? uh, we can keep the same ratio at, like, for us at our native altitude. Like, Stockton is like an altitude of nothing, and we go up and our exercise economy suffers the higher we get. I mean, it just gets bad. We have terrible exercise economy. The amount of metabolic consumption for the amount of work accomplished just starts to get silly. And for highlanders, for high altitude natives, the amount of work accomplished is similar to what we have for their native altitude. Similar body compositions too, who cares? But when you see the hearts, and when you see arterial circulation and the characteristics of the blood, the amount of hemoglobin, these are differences at the genetic level that you're going to see in high altitude natives. And then when we go up, all right, so when we go, a short-term visit, we're there for a week or 2 weeks or something, or we reside, and we're residing for 8 months or a year, something like that. The best time to get some comprehensive adaptation would be, let's go over there early. Same thing, like, when is it a good time to learn a language, to learn a new language? Not when you're 40. That's not a good time. It takes so much work to go through like Pimsleur's French or Rosetta Stone or whatever it is. That's tough. If you're like 7 years old, languages just sort of happen. Exposure is an acquisition. Exposure is training. Uh, and it's sort of similar with environmental adaptations, where exposure it bestows a little bit more of an advantage than older folks. Heart rate and stuff like that's going to change, whatever. The metabolism, we see the metabolic rate increasing. Remember, part of this is going to be metabolic inefficiency. There's going to be more calories consumed for the work accomplished for the task that you're doing, but also T3, T4. You look at the thyroid, triiodothyronine, thyroxine. You're looking at the thyroid metabolic regulation, and that's a contributor. That seems to be a contributor to the elevated metabolic rate. And then for a time, not forever, but for a time, you're going to see a stress response, sort of a Hanselian stress response. Now, with chronic exposure, if you're going to climb the mountain and become the resident, the chemoreceptors, there's going to be greater sensitivity initially. You'll experience a greater sensitivity to the conditions of the air. The hypoxia, you're going to be a little bit more in tune with what it is that you're breathing. Red blood cells, this happens right away. The amount of red blood cells, the EPO, erythropoietin, the kidneys regulation over bone marrow contribution to hematocrit. This is pretty rapid that's going to change. Iron uptake, that's pretty quick. Let's try to start getting some more hemoglobin in here. We got to carry some more oxygen. This blood is insufficient to get us through this task. Myoglobin increases. Muscle cross-sectional area decreases. Now remember, this is advantageous for just lugging around all that additional cross-sectional area, all that additional contractile machinery. If you can reduce the amount of that, the ratio is going to change. The ratio of mitochondria to muscle, and the ratio of capillary density to the muscle, it gets more advantageous for aerobic events and survival, right, at altitude. If you have smaller muscle, that's an advantage. Smaller muscle. Larger muscle is bad at altitude. You get this big cross-sectional area, and it's just harder for the oxygen to do what it's meant to do. And then there's a lot of enzymes. Just think about like all the aerobic enzymes. I mean, everything from lipolytic enzymes to AMPK. I mean, just all of this stuff is you'll upregulate that. Time course of things, nice little article from 98. It's a little bit older, but it's a good article that has sort of the time course. So this is minutes, right? So over here we're seeing minutes. Heart rate is going to start changing. Ventilation is going to start changing, and then the CO2 ventilatory response, and into days. Right, so days 1 to 100, and then to years, you're going to see some differences in years. Capillary density does take a little bit of time. That VEGF capillary density, let's get the city grid, let's get that to support the traffic a little bit more. Then there's a time component to that. Now the de-acclimatization, or if you're doing it in a hypobaric chamber, then it would be deacclimation if you decide to stop doing that. Doesn't take that long for some of these things to start disappearing, right? Your body's really noticing, we've talked about this, but your body's really noticing what you've been doing in the past few days, what you did last week. Do you remember what you ate for breakfast last week? Your body doesn't really remember what it did at the gym last week either. I mean, if you're really consistent all the time, this isn't a scientific statement, but I have a hunch here that if you've been super consistent with your breakfast for 10 years, well, I have a half a grapefruit and I put stevia on it, but it has to come from a green packet. And my tea, I put, a half a cup of milk in, so it's just like weird, milky, watery stuff. And yeah, if you're like it's a religious type of breakfast. Okay, yeah, well, you can remember what you ate a year ago. Then, and probably if you've been so consistent for the last 10 years, and every morning at 7 a.m. My alarm goes off, and I get this Pavlovian response that gets me out on the road, and then I do that. All right, yeah, sure. Maybe, this is again a scientific statement, but this is Courtney's philosophy is, yeah, likely the body's going to be able to have some idea that this is a consistent ritual for you. And all right, you're taking a couple of days off. That's fine. But most biological adaptation, you're just looking at the last few days and you're moving in that direction. It's a Now environmental stuff. You lay out in the sun and you get a tan, and then you go to Greenland and your tan starts to go away. It this might linger a little bit longer, just like coming down off the mountain might linger a little bit longer. Heat acclimation might linger a little bit longer than these deliberate, oh, I did my crunches and my burpees and what, it's some imposed exertional stress we seem to be a little bit more acute about. uh, Data here are sort of limited. These are just observations that are scarce in the literature. Remember, there's a peak altitude. I was talking about tea and milk in it, and then I took a sip, and it's just water, and I was expecting more than that. There's a peak altitude, above that, you're not getting positive adaptation. Now, but you like close to that, you're not really getting positive adaptation either. You want to be elevated. Okay, here's sea level. This is sea level right here, and over here is that is base camp of, I think that's Everest's base camp, if it says somewhere. Um, oh, here it is. So, the 5,800, whatever. I don't know. Who cares? What that Everest base camp is 5,500, and there's 5,800. But so sea level to that, somewhere between here, you're over here. This is where you're going to want to adapt. Is right here. If you just go up and start trying to, oh, let me see if I can adapt up here, that's not helpful. That's too high. You're not going to elicit positive changes in that domain over here. You want to be over here somewhere to get your results. Now, this is a look at getting into some training strategies. A strategy is pick the right altitude. Now, think specificity of adaptation. What altitude do you want to pick? Probably the one that is similar to your competition. Do a task analysis. Okay, I'm going to be playing soccer at an altitude of 2,000 meters. Okay, go train at 2,000 meters and do soccer tasks. Don't just like, well, I'm going to lay out in the sun and then I'm going to walk around and have it be cold. And then I'm going to, that's not helpful. Specificity of adaptation. Task analysis. What exactly do I need to do? What tasks? What time of day? What temperature is it going to be? What is the duration of activity? What is the intensity of activity? What is the air that I'm breathing? What are the shoes that I'm wearing? Figure out exactly the stresses of your endeavor, of your sport, of your activity, of whatever your recreational enthusiasm has you doing now. Figure that out and then go replicate it. And when you look, there's some nice older studies. A lot of these altitude things actually come from older studies. I mean, this is from 2018, but they're citing some older work. And looking at, so here's sea level. These are the white columns. That's sea level. It's stroke volume, it's heart rate, it's arterial oxygen saturation, it's hematocrit. Obviously carbon dioxide. I mean, so you can see what all these things are down here. But when you look at stuff like stroke volume, okay, here's sea level and high altitude on day 1. Now the altitude, you can see that's pretty high, 4,300 meters. High altitude day 1. Okay, high altitude day 15. high altitude day 22. So this stroke volume goes down and then it's sort of steady. You reach this deficit somewhat rapidly. Heart rate, I mean, it's immediate. Heart rate changes pretty much immediately. Um, and the cardiac output, you're going to see this, right? But when you start seeing some increases in things, so minute ventilation, how many breaths are you taking in a minute? It increases. And then on day 15, it's up. But day 22, it doesn't keep going. So, all right, maybe like 2 weeks to get to this point. And when we're looking at arterial oxygen saturation, like, is it the same as it is at sea level? Well, no, but it's better on day 15 than it is on day one. So starting to look at some of these things, um, the hematocrit, right? By day 15, is down a little. I don't think that's significant, but by about 2 weeks in, you're seeing a lot of the positive adaptations that you would need to be able to compete. And so timing for the training strategy, getting the timing right. Pick the altitude that is helpful. Don't just go super high because you think it's beneficial. Well, we're playing at 2,000 meters, so I'm going to train at 4,000 meters, then I'm going to bounce back down. Like, well, I have to run or I have to bench press 200 pounds as many times as I can. So I'm going to bench press 300 pounds as many times as I can for training. So that way, when I bounce back down to 200, it just feels light and I can keep going. Well, that's not really effective. Is that will you experience change that can help you? Sure. Is it the optimal training strategy? No. Task analysis, match it, and I just match it for a couple of weeks is what the data seem to suggest. And looking at, again, looking at some of these older studies, but they're not bad studies, which is why in 2018 they're still being cited as these sort of landmark, if anything has ever been land, if anything has ever marked land, some of these ones are candidates for that. But looking at the actual capacity, not just like, well, what is your ventilation, what is your hematocrit, but like, what's your performance here? Like, how are you actually performing? And so looking at a similar thing where it's you are 15 days at high altitude and you seem to be okay. That seems to be for the performance, for the acclimation or acclimatization protocol. Get a couple of weeks in and you seem to level off. You seem to level off at that point. So there's the philosophy of train low, sleep high, or live high and perform low. Maybe. Yeah, data aren't as comprehensive here as people think. This could potentially be good. And just think through the mechanisms. You guys could do this. What is important about the sport? Well, I need, let's say it's soccer. Or let's say is what's easiest is just say like a 10K or a mile. Let's say it's a mile. And I won't change my mind again. Let's say it's a mile. You're going to run 4 laps around the track and you want to do it in 5 minutes. That's a very specific rate of muscle contraction. Your muscle, the hammies and glutes and hip flexors and whatever, all of that stuff has to contract at a very specific rate. The cells have to, sliding filament theory, that has to slide, or cross bridge cycling has to cycle at a very specific rate to be able to do the mile in 5 minutes, like that. Now, if you're training high, good luck performing at that rate, right? Good luck performing at an intensity that is going to be compatible with your desired performance, that is going to prepare you in a sense for that goal of a performance. Rate of caloric consumption to support that. There are a lot of variables. And if you are training lower, you're able to accomplish those demands. You're able to incorporate those components of performance into your training. But you're not stressing yourself with the air, the quality of air, the I'm not talking like the pollution of the air, but the partial pressure of the air and the capacity, the hypoxic stressor. And during your performance, you're actually going to need to. So one can make a reasonable argument that if you train low, sleep high, that you are maximizing your training, but also exposing yourself to hypobaria and hypoxia. And there's truth to that, but it's not quite as true. It doesn't seem to be as effective as with the endurance athletes equivalent of gym science suggests. So what I would suggest is figure out exactly what you need to do to perform optimally and stress yourself with some low workouts so you can see those exposures. Stress yourself with some high workouts so you can perform within those stressors. And sleeping high, you're not going to get the same adaptation of just hanging out and sleeping at altitude or in the hypobaric chamber. Now, some people, a lot of cyclists, what they'll do is train, 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 train. They're super out of breath. Now, quick, get in the hypobaric chamber, and they just can't catch their breath. Oh, okay, there are some training techniques and stuff, but I haven't really seen the literature supporting that. Hypothetically, physiological hypothetical situations, we could argue that there's a reason to do that, but expose yourself to the actual altitude too during performance seems to be pretty helpful. Sex doesn't seem to matter, like biological sex, right? um, Male, female. The adaptations, the responses doesn't really seem to be any difference. So it's like, well, but I'm female. Should I train differently? Just do the same thing, right? The time course of all of this, the strategies to employ, uh, how your body responds to these stressors. We're all a bunch of people, and people tend to respond the same way, unless you have a lineage. If there's a genetic adaptation as a consequence of mom and dad's mom and dad's mom and dad's mom and dad's mom and dad, there's some nutritional parameters. You can incorporate these. I don't really talk about nutrition much, but there are some suggested dietary interventions that may help prepare you as you're getting ready to compete high. And again, it's especially important for people who, oh shit, I just lose the internet. Are you guys still, are you still there? Can anybody hear me? Still here. Can you see the screen, or do you see like, what slides can you see? Can you see the actual like slideshow? Because I
Yeah.
can't
Just
see.
hypobaria, training strategies, preparation.
Okay. Let me move all of my, yeah, I am looking at tons of, okay. Uh, okay, now are we at space flight?
Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, my screen just decided to put like 50 pop-ups of like every tab of everything that I've ever clicked on the screen. Okay, so now what we were on Everest before, hopefully we were below base camp on Everest. We were just sort of, wandering our way near the mountain or on the perimeter of the mountain before. And but now we go up, 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 up. There's your weather balloons. These are meteors, and like the aurora borealis. And here's the International Space Station. Keep going for a long time before you hit the moon. For the longest time, space exploration was a matter of telescopes. Of just look through some bent glass and what do you see? Oh, write that down. Um, and then in the 1960s, it's really not that long ago. I mean, before that, we're sending, crafts a bunch of machinery into space, but there aren't people with eyeballs and hearts and lungs and tissues and bones and whatever. That wasn't on the spacecrafts. And the first ever, we all know this, right? One giant leap for mankind. We know that thing, the Apollo 11 mission. Um, the first person to go into outer space was this Russian fellow with his big smile, and he orbited the Earth. He orbit fast. The circling of the planet is just to stay in orbit, to not go falling, descending toward Earth. You're at 25 times the speed of sound just to stay in orbit. So you know how this stuff works, where like if I take a baseball and let's say a Hunter takes a baseball, he's our resident baseball player, takes a baseball and pitches it. If it's going fast enough, if that baseball is traveling fast enough, its gravity it's descending according to gravity at the same rate that it is. Like if it slows down at all, it's going to submit to gravity. But the Earth curves. Right, the Earth has a curvature to it. And so if it's going fast enough and it's being pulled down by gravity at the same rate that Earth is curving, it just sort of stays in the air. Right, that's what you're doing when you're circling the planet. You have to go really, really fast to circle, to orbit. And so that's why it's like the whole, I mean, like this guy orbited Earth in 108 minutes. And then that was it. That was the first ever flight in 1961. To reach that escape velocity, for that baseball to start to, ascend into space, or to broaden your orbit, to go farther away from Earth. It's a 40% increase in speed, but the International Space Station, I mean, I think that thing orbits the Earth like 16 times a day or something. I mean, it's very fast. And so that was the first ever, person in space. But the moon landing, right? The moon is quite a bit farther away from the International Space Station. The International Space Station is pretty close. Right now, I think there's about 6 people living on there. There's people living on the space station all the time, and there's a lot of stressors of being there. Now, there's research that's constantly being done, and it really is the International Space Station. It's not a U.S. thing. It's very international. But think about the stressor, and Mars is a really long way. Will people walk on Mars at some point? Yeah, but 6 months to get there. You're going to have you're going to be sort of a biological mess by the time you arrive. Now, there are interventions to try to retain your tissues and have adequate perfusion to those tissues and not come back with no bones. And, there's a lot of interventions that we'll talk about today. The moon is a little bit closer, but we haven't been to the moon very much. We went for a few years, right? 1969 to 1972, there were 6 moon landings, and then never again. Nobody's been on the moon since. So that's Buzz Aldrin right here on the moon. And there's apparently Buzz Aldrin on a 4th of July exhibiting patriotism in a festive way. But as we go to the moon and we get off the aircraft and walk around, or we go to the International Space Station and we float around and use your eyes and submit to that amount of gravity, we're going to get a lot of changes. There's going to be a lot of biological changes, and there's going to be psychology involved too. But like social networking, there's a type of post that people will do, like, oh, yay, here's my hair. It's like it's floating around in space. This is an actual astronaut. And this is her hair on Earth, and this is her hair out in space. And it's not being matted down by gravity. Gravity has nothing to say about where her hair goes. But the psychological stress, this is a huge piece. Think about microgravity as more than simply high energy particles, the radiations, like space radiation down here. These high energy particles that are just pelting you all the time. The astronauts can see it. The astronauts with closed eyes can see flashes of light, little neutrons or whatever, just blasting through them. There's a lot of radiation. The risk, if there's too much of it, your risk of cancer is going way up. We'll talk about muscle atrophy. We'll talk about bone mineral loss and circulatory changes and all of this. But think about the psychology here. There's a psychological stimulation you have even in quarantine. There's an amount of psychological stimulation that whatever you feel like doing, you turn on whatever the entertainment source is, and you're talking with people over Zoom, and you're doing, and all these responsibilities, and you can go for a walk, and there's all of this psychological stimulation and social engagement when you're in space, in that International Space Station, or en route to the round trip, if you're on the trip part of that. That is a lonely, isolated, tiny space to occupy with little to do and almost no communication. There's psychological distress here that is adding to the allostatic load. I mean, just put someone in, like a prisoner. Oh, they put me in the hole or whatever. Oh, they like come out a different person with like a bunch of psychoses, this sort of psychological distress that accumulates. And there's a similar phenomenon that the astronauts need to endure. It's not a happy, healthy time to have that amount of isolation. Also, the threat of death is constant. There is a constant threat of death. Asteroid bits are pelting the ship all the time. The ship and the space station, it's just being pelted all the time. One of those could be pretty detrimental. Think of like if your house or apartment or something, we're just being pelted by bullets sometimes, and one of these times, you're like in front of the window, so there's this constant worry. But also, you have to be everything. If you are the astronaut and you're on that space station, can you go to the hospital? Well, no. So you have to be trained. You have to be trained to do all of the basic things, right? You don't necessarily have to be trained to do like heart surgery or something, but anything that an EMT can do, you can do better if you are an astronaut, and you need to, because death is the consequence. For an EMT, someone else can just pick it up. It's like, oh shit, I forgot this part, or I'm bad at this. Will you? It's just like, oh, fine, we'll do it at the hospital. Okay, you have to be better than an EMT at all this medical stuff. You have to be a plumber. You have to understand that. Right, you have to be an electrician. You have to understand shit goes wrong all the time. You have to be a computer programmer. You can't go to the store. You have to, like, all the breath you're breathing and you're pissing, and like you have to convert that into drinkable water. What's your water supply? And so there's so much to do, and you have to be an expert in all of it, on top of doing whatever the research is that you're doing, while you're having these flashes in your eyes all the time as you're being pelted by these high energy particles. You're being radiated, and so there's a psychological stress here that is unlike any other known environment, at least an environment that I know of, and that adds to the allostatic load, the summation of stresses. But there's lots of problems, and people will post stuff like this, oh, look at me, I'm holding up an astronaut with one finger. How exciting is this? Just like Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? Oh, look at me, I'm holding up there. But people don't go and then post the picture where they're like atrophied and sad, and the clinical depression is so overwhelming, and here's how difficult it is to shit and piss. I mean, like, where does like shit go? Gravity doesn't pull it out. Like really squeeze that thing out of there, and like brushing your teeth, and where do you how do you get the like, everything is a problem. Nothing is not a problem. And yet people post that, like when somebody like goes on vacation and they post the pictures of the beach and whatever, like that's not what the trip was like. That was a photo op. That was a photo op that makes it look like you had a good time. You had a terrible time. You go to Disneyland and everyone thinks, oh, it was so much fun. I know you stood in line on hot concrete for 2 hours next to a screaming child, and you were on the ride for 2.5 minutes. And then there's 2 more hours on hot concrete, and you had like this terrible sunburn, and you had a heat stroke. Don't tell me you had a blast, right? When 99% of the time was excruciating, you just didn't post those pictures on Instagram or whatever. Almost the entire trip was insufferable horrible, and then you splashed for a second, but that's what you posted the picture of. That is sort of a similar phenomenon. Life is not supposed to be pleasant all the time. Life is filled with stress more than it is happiness, and coping skills are so critical. We have to cope because nobody's life is good. And when you go into outer space, right, man, it's not like this picture. That's not what it's like. Now, initially, you go into outer space, and 60 to 80% of these astronauts who are super trained, these astronauts are some of the fittest, healthiest, certainly fit for this, healthiest people. It is so hard to become an astronaut. You can't just go do it. Oh, I want to go become an astronaut. I had a friend who wanted to be an astronaut, and like, I mean, we did our PhDs together, but um, he uh, he went to Swarthmore for his undergrad. Um, and he went to Oxford for his master's, and like near perfect everything scores. And then he did his PhD at UConn, and I mean, he could run his first ever marathon was 2 hours and 20 minutes, and he's like, man, I hurt my hip on mile 9 and I did shitty. Like, dude, you run like do the math, figure out what your pace is. I mean, but he wanted to be an astronaut, and it's just like, hey, it's impossible to be an astronaut. These people are outrageous. I want to grow up and be an astronaut. Okay, well, dedicate your life and have no friends and no family and have no hobbies. And I mean that, and maybe we'll talk. And even among astronauts, I mean, it's 3/4 of these people are experiencing all of these symptoms when they go up in space. Now, this little article right here is saying, like, space tourism coming soon. Do you have $250,000? We'll send you up for a little bit. We'll throw you around the Earth for a minute and bring you back down. But we're having astronauts. I mean, you can see right here, space motion sickness is experienced by 60 to 80% of space travelers. 2006, who were our space travelers? Astronauts, right, during the first couple of days. But there's tons of things, all these fluid shifts that are happening, the cranial fluid shifts. You see this visible puffiness in somebody's face. It looks like I don't know, Cushing syndrome or something like that, where you get this, like, this moon face, you get this puffy face. And but a lot of the problem that people are going to have is, like, if you oil and vinegar is going to separate with gravity, but it doesn't separate when you're in outer space. Oil and vinegar, you don't need an emulsifier in outer space. Shake it, fine. Yeah, it's just there. It's just like, this is nice salad dressing, right? In outer space. In Earth, it just separates. But we go up there and we're going to start looking at a lot of fluid shifts that we wouldn't experience at home in Earth gravity. And we have these fluids are so critical. The vestibular apparatus, right? So we have these semicircular canals are filled with fluids, and we have this nervous input of them, and we're detecting our head's motion, our like, when you're sitting in a car and someone jams on the brakes, you're like, and you like freak out and whatever. It's a bunch of semicircular canal information of what's our acceleration, our deceleration, our position in space, and it doesn't really work well in microgravity. This doesn't work very well. And your eyes are giving you some information on the ship. If you're at the space station, you're on the ship or something like that. Okay, yeah, you can tell what's up and what's down and where stuff is. Whenever look out the window, what the hell is up? I have no idea. And even on the ship, it's a little bit misleading. It's a little bit it's not quite as obvious as it could be, what's up and what's down. And terrestrial edema. Just looking at the comments. But so we have this communication in our inner ear, or the vestibular apparatus in our eyes, that give us sort of a false sense of position. And it's worse than if you're merely deep sea fishing. Remember I told a story about me, thinking I was macho and declining the Dramamine? He's like, no, I'm Courtney Jensen. Come on, I'm not a sissy. I can handle a boat. I can rock around a little bit with a wave. Ooh, there's a tide. How scared am I? And then I just vomited the entire time. This is much more serious than that, and it's more chronic. On the boat, I was looking at shore thinking, like, I'm a pretty good swimmer. I bet, like, I'm not like Cameron. I didn't know Cameron at the time, but like I think I can make it back. And I was considering just jumping off the boat and swimming to shore because I was so sick. But if you're at the International Space Station, you're not even on the planet. How do you get back? You just got to cope. You have to cope with this, and tons of people are getting sick. Now, these fluid changes, what you're going to see, I mean, this is a little bit of an exaggeration. It looks like I don't know, a character from Mike Tyson's Punch Out or something like that. But your legs, you're going to get these little bird legs. You get these. Normally for people, blood gravity is pulling unless you're permanently prone. And that's how you go through life or whatever. Um, we have blood pooling in our legs, and you have the skeletal muscle pump, and we're trying to get venous return to the heart that way. And there's a lot of biological responses to gravity. When you eliminate gravity, the blood, it ends up in your chest and head, and you get these dimension changes. Your actual body, that's what I was talking about, the puffy face that people get. You get this puffy face. The fluids get shifted in your body to the chest, to your kind of stomach, chest, core circulation, to your head. And then the total cardiac activity, you're going to get ventricular, left ventricular atrophy. It's really the heart, it's just there's all this fluid. And the classic story that people tell, it's a little bit more complicated than this. This is a simple perspective. Is, as you know, you have baroreceptors. Okay, you have baroreceptors in the carotids, right? You have baroreceptors in the aorta, and that's where you're getting all this fluid to be moved. All this fluid is shifting out of your legs and being moved into this central circulation, and the baroreceptors are going to notice. Now, this is true, but this is a simpler story than the reality of it. You also have atria. Your heart has some chambers in it. You have some ventricles, you have some atria in there. Hopefully you just have a couple of each. And atrial natriuretic peptide, if you distend the heart, the atria, it notices, all right, we have a lot of blood volume here, so I guess atrial natriuretic peptide, let's pee some of this stuff out, right? This is too much in here. So it's almost, there's a pressure sensation that is in the heart as well. And so you're going to, and there's also a loss of thirst. And this, everyone experiences this loss of thirst, and not all of it is connected to, like, I'm nauseous, I'm trying not to throw up. Why do I want to swallow more fluid when I'm trying to keep down what I already have? Maybe that's going to be part of it, but there seems to be a loss of thirst that's above and beyond that. You have to be very conscientious about what you're swallowing. And a decreased secretion of erythropoietin. So the red cells are being lowered. Total blood volume is going down. This big fluid shift. But there's what you see at the same time. So here, the baroreceptors. This is sort of talking about the kind of classic presentation where ADH, all right, this is from 2001, so ADH, antidiuretic hormone, remember that's vasopressin. Since this time, vasopressin has become arginine vasopressin, AVP, or just vasopressin has become the accepted vernacular for antidiuretic hormone, but it's the same thing, exact same thing. And then the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, you know what that is. For the fluid loss for these things, the reduction in total plasma volume, so the blood volume, appropriate for existence in microgravity, 10 to 15% reduction. But there's a little bit more to it than that. Again, the extracellular fluid decreases by 10 to 15% in microgravity, and intercellular fluid appears to increase. So the intracellular fluid, it tends to be a shift in where this stuff is. You actually do get a decrease in total fluid volume. You do see a red blood cell decrease within a week of being in space. That part is the easy story, is the real story, it seems to be. But the intracellular fluid as compared to the extracellular fluid, so where those fluids reside in you. For ACSM this year, we published a couple of these abstracts on fluid shifts and looking at collegiate athletes as compared to CrossFit. athletes, and intracellular and extracellular and total body fluid. So the total body water, what they were looking at in this study, it's the same. They didn't actually see a difference in total body water. What they saw pre-flight to post-flight is more intracellular fluid, less extracellular fluid. So the fluid shifts, but you actually do see you do see some total loss of fluid, more urine being released, being diuresed, and but so this is the expectation of what happens from departure to reunion. Okay, so here's you on Earth. You're right here. This is your fluid distribution. Here's your head, obviously. Here's your heart and your legs, and blood is pooling down your legs. Now you go into space. And what you see, remember, your legs get all kind of skinny, and the fluids are put into this central circulation in your brain and in your heart right here. Now, over time, you do see this, not as much as was originally thought, where there's a reduction in total amount of fluid. The total amount of fluid is going to go down a little bit. Your legs are still going to have this little tiny amount. Then you return to Earth. Now what happens? Blood pools in your leg. Right? I'm assuming you have two. You didn't lose one when you're way up there. But look at the brain circulation, right? When you first go into outer space, like, wow, that's an awful lot. And then it sort of stabilizes, sort of something like this. And then you have less total fluid. And like now, like that's bad, right? This is bad. Now you're going to adapt, right? You're going to adapt, but those first days of adaptation are not pleasant ones. This is also an extreme looking diagram, but if it were less extreme, it would be harder to illustrate the point if we were showing the actual amount of fluid shifts. Now, when you go into outer space, you go into microgravity, your tissues are going to endure a lot of stress. At first, at blast off, you're going to endure some stress. You're going to get a little bit beat up for a few minutes. You're at 15 times the speed of sound. All that stuff, blast off, 10, 9, 8, and then for no reason, right, they're counting down, and then you go. 15 times the speed of sound, and you just, the acceleration, you're sort of like crunching your neck against that resistance. Your whole body is just being shaken and battered by the thrust of it all. Just your head is being pummeled. Okay, so you get, and then there's microgravity, right? So there's a different type of physical stress at blast off. Then there is when you're in microgravity. In microgravity, it's a matter of atrophy. It's a matter of absence of stress, absence of all that battering, absence of disruption of membranes and of those cells and tissues. So we have to invent things to keep from atrophying so much. I mean, if you just lie in bed, head down tilt, you'll see HDT, you'll see that abbreviation often enough in a lot of the literature for both atrophy and microgravity, head down tilt, HDT, looking at these sedentary, extreme sedentary, let's simulate the microgravity experience. And the atrophy is so fast. It's not just muscle, it's just sinews and bones and all your stuff just starts to decay. But what do? You go up into space if what you do is bands, like surgical tubing, kind of like resistance bands. That has nothing to do with gravity. That doesn't, think Wolff's law, think specificity of adaptation. That has nothing to do, it gets more and more and more intense the more and more and more you stretch it. What does that have to do with walking on Earth? So take the bands up there, and they only weigh 4 ounces, and you have this whole set of them from the the pink to the black from the tensile force. Okay, so that you can put an entire workout kit in your pocket. You're going to come back to Earth, and you're not going to be able to walk, though. because it has nothing to do with walking and earth mechanics and sort of the biomechanics of that. This is Philip Golnick over here. He did a lot of the initial work. He's no longer alive, but he was in Washington State, University of Washington, and looking at these biopsies of all right, send some bodies up and let's see what happens to the tissue. Oh, it's terrible when they get back. The initial work was Philip Golnick, and like, okay, we need interventions. We're going to send people up in space. That shouldn't be a death sentence, for their athletic capacity. Maybe it's a death sentence for the physics gone wrong, if it's like the Challenger or something. But if physics go right, if you get people into space, into the International Space Station, or on the moon or whatever, yeah, maybe we should get them back with the ability to walk. And it's what we have to do is come up with ways of exerting force that replicate, like, because think again, the bands, or oh um like a bow flex or something like that. Again, it just gets harder and harder as you go. It doesn't make any sense. But when people use vacuums, you have like this, right? So this little valve, and you just move that valve back and forth. You create this vacuum. You pull the force out here and you push it, and that seems to work pretty well. So as people try to replicate Earth gravity, um, isotonic resistance, something that's similar, that's consistent throughout a range of motion, an isotonic load. This is really the best that they've come up with, and just where that fulcrum is, where you move that fulcrum is going, it's going to change the moment arm of the force and the load. If you remember moment arms. So the moment arm of the load, the moment arm of the force, and just where you move this fulcrum is going to change how much you need to exert. And then just using these vacuums and like little pistons and moving them back and forth, that seems to be really the most effective strategy. So these are astronauts here. He is, and he is, and this is just like a guy doing a little story on the squat rack using those sorts of vacuums as loads, and it really does replicate uh, Earth gravity. And you sort of, you're down, and then you go, up or whatever. You're here, and you kind of move back and forth. I think Proteus would actually be a better option for upper body stuff, but Proteus isn't effective for lower body in this particular capacity. Maybe it's effective for lower body and measuring things like a vertical jump and power output, or a broad jump and whatever. But in terms of creating a biomechanical environment that replicates Earth's gravity, Proteus would be effective for upper body, as it's a constant three-dimensional isotonic force. That's equipment like that is tough, and you have to figure out how to get that. So this isn't, in the International Space Station they have these things, because if they didn't, and you go up in outer space and you don't load your tissues, if you withdraw stress, if you deny those tissues loading, you see bone density just depleting, 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 depleting. It doesn't take that long. And I mean, you can just now, nobody does this. Nobody's going to be like, all right, here's my bone density. And, I go into outer space for, 30 months or whatever. And I have half, because nobody goes into outer space and is like, I will just never exercise. Like, that's not a thing. People go into outer space and exercise. But what you see, where you see the bone density being drawn from, the bone mineral density, the minerals themselves, where you see the mineral loss, you're literally pissing out these minerals in your spine, your pelvis. When older people, they fall and they break their hip, that's this, right? That's what you're seeing. The bulk of this bone density being drawn from is what used to have a lot of compression, a lot of loading. It used to be this very involved core of your architecture, right? These were support beams. These are weight bearing beams in you, and then not really anymore. You're in outer space. What does this need to do? So you start losing bone density. Your body is constantly trying to maintain the form that is optimal for its environment. Right? You are optimizing your form for its environment. That's what fitness means. Are you equipped to tolerate your environmental stresses? Are you optimized for them? Is your body the ideal instrument to operate in this particular set of stressors and whatever. And you don't need a ton of bone to be in outer space. And so, osteoblast, osteoclast relationship, those osteoclasts start outpacing it. So, think like protein turnover, the balance between synthesis and degradation. Atrophy is just protein degradation outpacing protein synthesis. Hypertrophy is protein synthesis outpacing protein degradation. There's constant turnover. This protein metabolism or protein turnover, whatever you want to call it, you are constantly in anabolic and catabolic mode. And are you growing? Anabolic mode is outpacing. Are you shrinking? Catabolic mode is outpacing. It's the same thing with bone formation. Is not keeping up with resorption, with kind of osteoclast destruction. Now, we have these chemists who are constantly evaluating astronaut P. That's what she is. This isn't just a picture of whatever, and I'm talking about an unrelated story. She's analyzing astronaut P and looking at these minerals, the bone mineral density, these minerals that you're peeing out to evaluate load profiles, and are we maintaining bones, and so this is that device that has those sort of little pistons using those vacuums, trying to replicate some sort of Earth isotonic load profile on the tissue, and bone mineral density percent changed per month, using some other equipment, right? So, or like no exercise equipment, and the preservation of bone seems to be pretty effective if you can do that. But it's important to maintain the health of these people as they go up into space, so they don't come back, needing something stronger than crutches. Okay, that's altitude. Do we have some questions? Remember, I won't be here on Friday, so get into vacation mode now. This is Friday. Start celebrating. Nathaniel, pull out your drink. Pour yourself. It's gotta be like, I guess it's past eggnog season. All right, you got your drink handy. There it is. All right, you got it. Yeah. So this is happy weekend now. And then what do we have left? We're going to do sleep. So starting Monday of next week, it is sleep deprivation, it's shift work, it's disturbances of jet lag, and it's stuff like that is what we're going to talk about. JP, yes. Kajal, yes. All right. Everyone get out of here except for people who want to stick around and talk about non-class stuff. Go, maybe you have other stuff to do that's not weekend related, but go start Nathaniel-ing. I'm going to stop the recording.
I actually have 3 different separate questions.
Okay, are they like physiological, or are they like logistic stuff?
Logistic stuff.
Then I am stopping the recording and go.